Okay guys, so today I wanted to do a video on the parts of a saddle. Now in this video, it's also going to have parts of a Western saddle and parts of an English saddle. So no matter what style you ride, this will be informational for both. It's good to understand the parts of your saddle, that way you know what each piece does, how it works, what its function is, so on and so forth. So I'm going to start with this one. This is optional here. This is the breast collar or breastplate, depending on what you learn to call it. So not everyone uses these. They're not required by any means. They just secure the saddle into the correct place a little bit better and holds it forward instead of letting it slip back. Another thing that's optional is this little seat cover. I've had this seat cover on this saddle since we bought it, which it wasn't mine when we first got it. Because my grandma needed a little extra cushion because this was her saddle to begin with, and I just never have taken it off. So the first thing on a Western saddle that everyone knows is the horn. Everyone thinks this is a handle. That's not its purpose. The point of a horn was so that you could wrap your lasso around the horn itself. A lot of people like to use it as a handle. I use it just because I'm lazy and like to lean on it. But so that was its purpose. And then these pieces here are called the pommel. And then underneath the pommel you have what's called the gullet. And that goes all the way back to the back of the saddle. And the tree is what forms that gullet. That gives the horse a little bit of room between its spine. So then coming down here you have the seat itself, which is where your butt goes. And then you have the cantle. On a Western saddle, the cantle is much, much larger because it's meant to keep you in the saddle. So then this piece here is called the jockey. This is just to cover up the rigging that holds this piece into place. And then on Western saddles, you have these things called conchos. It's just a screw that goes into the saddle that holds the saddle together. And then here you have this thing that my cinch is on. It's called a Cinch Keeper. You don't have to put your cinch on this. I just find that's a little bit easier if you put your cinch on this. And then this is my cinch. A cinch is different than a girth. Girths are used in English tack, and cinches are used in Western tack. A lot of people use those words interchangeably, but they aren't interchangeable. There's a difference, and I will explain the difference when I bring the English saddle out. So then the piece that holds the girth onto the saddle is called the Off Billet. And this just makes it so that your cinch has somewhere to go. You can't put the cinch up onto this D-ring here. So there's a D-ring there. So there are two D-rings on this saddle. There's the front D-ring and the rear D-ring. Now, depending on the type of saddle that you have, you can have a rear cinch. This saddle doesn't have one. It's a barrel saddle. Barrel saddles don't have rear cinches. Roping saddles, for the most part, do. And then on the other side, you'll have what's called your latigo. Some people call it a cinch tie. Some people would just call it a tie strap. But if you were to look it up in either a tack store or online, it is called a latigo. So then back here you have the rear rigging, which is another, it just holds, it covers up the rigging that holds onto this D-ring. And then you have another little D-ring here that holds these saddle strings. What these saddle strings do, a lot of people think that they're just useless, they're there for show, but these little saddle strings hold on your saddlebags. So if you put a saddlebag back here, these hold in place. And then this piece here is the skirt. Everything sits on top of the skirt. And then coming down here you have your fender. And the fender is where your leg goes. Then you have what's called hobble straps or stirrup straps. These just make it so that your stirrup doesn't flip around and turn on you. So then this is your stirrup. And then this is a stirrup leather. It's just to give you a little bit more traction so your foot doesn't slip out of the stirrup as easily. And not every saddle has this. It just depends on the type of stirrup, and Western stirrups can come in metal, wood, or in like a plastic. So those are the pieces of a Western saddle. These are very basic pieces, but the Western saddle is a lot more complicated than the English saddle, and I'm going to go grab an English saddle, and I'll be right back. Okay, so now we have our English saddle here. This is Susan's English saddle. I don't own one anymore. And as you can see, English saddles are much smaller. They're also much lighter. My Western saddle is a synthetic saddle, which is the lightest Western saddle you can buy. And it's still heavier than this saddle. Not by much, but it still is heavier. And they have a lot fewer pieces to an English saddle, so they're not as complex. And this saddle here is an all-around saddle. There's a difference between a jumping saddle and a dressage saddle. A dressage saddle is similar to the seat of a Western saddle in that it is meant to keep the rider in the seat, whereas a jumping saddle is more used for propelling the rider out of the saddle and getting it so that they stand up a little bit more out of it. So they'll have a more shallow dip in the seat. This one has a medium, so it's an all-purpose saddle. So the first thing is the pommel, which is similar to the Western saddle, except it's much smaller. Then you have these little circles here, which just are a facet to hold the saddle together. You've got a couple. There is what's called the skirt here. Now on the Western saddle, it's that very bottom piece. On an English saddle, it's up at the top. Then you have what's called the twist or the waist, which is where the seat comes in very close together. Then you have your seat itself. And then you have the cantle. This cantle is actually kind of high on the saddle, but not as high as a dressage saddle. Then you've also got a couple of D-rings back here in case you want to put some other harness equipment on the horse. And then this piece here is the panel. This is just a little extra padding for the horse's back. And just like the Western saddle, you have your gullet, which goes all the way back. Then you have this thing here, which is called the Stirrup Leathers, which holds your stirrup irons, which on an English saddle, stirrups are always iron or made of a metal. And this particular one has a stirrup grip on it. Not all have these, but most of them do. And then this little piece of leather here is called the leather keeper. And this is just so that the end of your leathers stay out of the way. They don't get tangled up in your stirrup and whatnot. So then right here in the front you have your knee roll. And this just makes it so that your knees stick out a little bit on the saddle. That way they don't turn in and grip on the horse because you don't want to do that. It actually throws your balance a little bit. And then you've got a couple little D-rings up here in the front that you can see. And these are for breast collars and other types of that material or that type of tack. So, but the knee roll connects to the flap, which is just where your leg sits on the saddle. And then if I just throw the stirrup up out of the way for a second, underneath that you have what's called the billet guard. This just makes it so that the girth doesn't scratch up the inside of the flap. And then you have 3 billet straps and your lining. You put your girth on the first and last 2. And the reason why you have a third is because if one of these breaks, it's very difficult for you to replace them. So this is there in case you break it. That way you've got a little bit of an insurance on the saddle. So I'm going to go grab a girth because I forgot to do that. And then I'll show you the difference between a girth and a cinch. Okay, so now I have a girth and a cinch. Now, as you can tell by looking at them, that the girth has 2 little buckles, while the cinch has just 1 big buckle. That's the main difference between the two. And that's because the Latigo is only 1 piece of leather, whereas the Billets is 2 different pieces of leather. This particular cinch is a mohair cinch. I personally prefer the mohair cinches over anything else because they grip on the horse a little bit better. This is a leather girth, and it's got, most girths have just stretchy on one side. As you can see, this material is a bit stretchy. And then the other side is stationary, so you can't pull on it. Some have stretchy on both sides, but for the most part, they have a stationary side and a stretchy side. The stretchy side goes on the left side because that's the side that you do the girth up on. The reason why the girth is separated from an English saddle is so that it keeps it a lot cleaner. And also because it can actually damage the girth, leaving it there because it does sit underneath the saddle, whereas a cinch sits sort of on top of the saddle. So if you were to leave it on there and then put it over the top of the saddle like a lot of Western people do, you would have big bends in your girth, and you don't want that. So a lot of people will leave their girth sitting over the top of the saddle. For the most part, English saddles come in either leather or with a fleece on the inside. I personally prefer, out of the English girths, the fleece inside because I find that it holds onto the horse better. Western girths can come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. There are new padded ones. There are ones that are the mohair. There are the ones that have the fleece. You don't see very many leather girths or cinches. It's just not as popular. So I hope this video was helpful, guys, on the parts of the saddles. And if you have any more questions, go ahead and put those in the comment section, and I will get to them as soon as possible. And we're going to end it there.